This Fed Gov Today program is sponsored by Iron Mountain Government Solutions and Carasoft. On this edition of Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose, the Coast Guard ups the ante for allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, stopping the data avalanche from consuming your agency. And as the Arctic gets warmer, the competition ramps up. Welcome to Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose. The Coast Guard cutter Midget is back in port in Honolulu after a 76-day deployment to the Indo-Pacific and Oceania. The ship collaborated with Coast Guards and navies of more than a dozen countries. Vice Admiral Andrew Tiongson is commander of the Pacific area for the Coast Guard. At the Navy League's Sea Air Space, he tells me the Guard's more involved in that part of the world than ever.
And when we talk about the Indo-Pacific in general, we typically talk about the threat of our adversary, the PRC, China, and what that means in what I would call the Western Pacific. My intent today is to kind of broaden that aperture. I don't only want to talk about that, but I want to talk about the national emergency that's been declared right here on our southern border and in the Pacific. And what is the Coast Guard doing to look at our maritime borders and approaches and to gain control of those and to prevent threats from entering our nation?
What's the action that you're taking in the Eastern Pacific now, and how does that connect to the mission in the rest of your AOR?
Again, thank you for that question. So first, in my area of responsibility, I have the maritime boundary line that's right between Mexico and San Diego. And what we have seen is as we have tightened up on the land borders, we have seen an increase of flow to about 54% of illegal migrants trying to enter our country from that area and coming around and getting into, I'll call it the Central California region. That's a problem. That's a problem for a couple of reasons. One, these are all unvetted migrants. We don't know what their background is. We don't know if they're criminals. We don't know if they're terrorists. We don't know any of that stuff. And I'll offer you this too, that what we have seen is a significant increase, 200% type increase of other than Mexican aliens coming across in that way. So what we have done there is we have tripled our presence in that region with vessels and aircraft and small boats to gain control of that border approach and to prevent these things or these people from entering the United States who may harm Americans. In addition to that, I would say counter-drug. Now, in the Eastern Pacific, it's mainly about cocaine that comes across, but we cannot forget that these organizations, transnational criminal organizations or terrorist organizations, they have all different lines of business. And from those lines of business, they get profit. And that profit can be used in many different ways. And these same folks that are dealing in cocaine are dealing in things like fentanyl. And if they have a lot of profit from cocaine, you know where that goes. It goes to fentanyl. And then we know what happens with fentanyl in the United States. It's killing Americans. Mm-hmm. And I would offer you that a lot of those deaths are also traced with cocaine. We have been getting after that very intentionally, and it increased assets that down there in the Eastern Pacific. To date, in this fiscal year, we're at 91,000 kilograms of cocaine that have been interdicted.
How has the presence, the required increased presence in the Eastern Pacific, changed the posture of your presence in the Western Pacific, Admiral?
So this is a great thing for me. Because what I do in the Western Pacific is I provide large ships, first off, like national security cutters. In fact, I have one that's in the pre-deployment preparations right now that will go into the Western Pacific. They will work with our friends from Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, and other nations that are there too, all our partners. In addition to that, we send small teams, and it's amazing what Coast Guard small teams can do in terms of becoming a trusted partner, in terms of making a difference with the nation so that they believe in America moving forward. And that all helps our territorial integrity, without a doubt. So when I say teams, I have teams that are deployed right now in Indonesia and in the Philippines. I have another team right this second that is in China, talking with partners like Japan and the Philippines, and certainly the Chinese are there as well. But we're looking at maritime governance in general. What can we do to increase the regional security, which makes us in the United States stronger and, frankly, more prosperous?
One of the things that you and I have discussed in the past is the reception that you get, the positive reception that you get from the Coast Guards and navies of allies and partners. You mentioned Japan, South Korea, and others. Is that relationship, in your view, as strong as it's ever been, sir?
Without any doubt. And I would say it's getting stronger and stronger over time. So again, I've been in my job for about close to 3 years now, and I have seen it increase every year as we've gone through this. And certainly my predecessors have laid that foundation that enabled me to continue to move up and strengthen those relationships moving forward. Just a couple of weeks ago, I talked to all of those leaders just to touch base and to see how we're doing. And in fact, the ship we're deploying there will be doing a multilateral operation with the Philippine Coast Guard, Japan Coast Guard, and South Korea.
I read that the Coast Guard is in line for an increase in funding levels. What do you need in your area of responsibility if funds become available to plus you up?
I'll start with aviation. So, for example, we in the Coast Guard, we run our H-60 aircraft to 19,000 hours. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody else at this venue that runs 60 aircraft, 60 helicopters to that level. I have ones that are approaching 19,000. I have ones that are already there. They are grounded or about to be grounded. I need rotary wing assets. I have a fleet of C-27 fixed-wing aircraft. The availability rate for those aircraft in my nearly 3 years in my job has been dismal. Dismal. I need to replace those. I need fixed wing assets. I need that for lift, and I need it for maritime patrol to improve our maritime domain awareness. What's going on in our AOR? So I need those things. Francis, I'm operating cutters that are 50, well, I'm over 50 years old, but they are 50 years old, and for a ship that's very, very old. A 210-foot cutter is there. Our only heavy icebreaker is there. We need to get after recapitalizing those medium endurance cutters with our offshore patrol cutter program, as well as our polar security cutter program, and Arctic security cutter program, and we need that yesterday.
The Arctic security cutters are in the pipeline, though there is relief for the Polar Star coming. What does the rest of the pipeline look like, and what do you need to get started into that pipeline right now?
Yeah, what we need is money. We need funding. Our overall budget, somewhere around $13.5 billion. It's about 2% of all of the DoD budget. Our acquisition budget to buy these new assets we're talking about, less than $2 billion. You can't replace all of this with a meager $2 billion. And I know I said meager in there, and $2 billion is a lot, but when you talk about vessels that are going into the high latitudes, like the Arctic or the Antarctic, that costs a lot of money per vessel. When you talk about helicopters, when you talk about fixed-wing aircraft, it's a lot of money. I do see some hope that's out there. I understand that we are considered in the reconciliation packages or bills that are being negotiated right now with our OMB and the Capitol Hill. What I think we need mostly is support and advocacy. Support and advocacy from anybody who's out there that believes in the U.S. Coast Guard, our missions, and what we do for the American public, and to get out there and say, we need to recapitalize and maintain to improve the readiness of this service so we can protect the United States of America.
Coast Guard Vice Admiral Andrew Tiongson. You can read more about his area of responsibility on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, stopping the data avalanche from consuming your agency. Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose continues in a moment.
Some barriers that I do see outside of procurement are limited availability of trained resources in artificial intelligence, right? So both from the industry as well as that. I think government needs to upskill the force, invest in talent acquisition, collaborate and partner with the industry. In that way, they can bridge the gap that we see.
Welcome back. The Chief Information Officer of the Navy, Jane Rathbun, told you on last week's Fed Gov Today TV, data is a critical part of her service's Information Superiority Vision 2.0. You can watch that show in the archives at fedgovtoday.com. Melissa Carson is Vice President and General Manager of Iron Mountain Government Solutions. At Sea Air Space, she says the department's data deluge isn't going away.
Data is needed for every part of the operation, servicing both the war fighters there, but then also the highly integral systems to even navigate, right, anymore. So it is now going to become the standard there, and, needing a good, solid data foundation in order to be able to both either make the right decisions for the war fighters real time, right, or make sure, right, they navigate correctly through.
Yeah. What makes a good data system? Are the services getting better at putting a whole chain, an infrastructure in place to be able to support the data needs, for example, in warfighting at the tip of the spear?
Yes, slowly but surely, right? But we're finally seeing that they're paying attention to kind of a strong data management governance piece. They've realized, as they've been kind of dabbling in AI, it's been around for a while, along with machine learning and some of those pieces, that weren't getting the right decisions. And what they found out was they're missing data. They didn't know where data was, or what I call is kind of, speaking to the Navy, kind of swimming in data there, right? So most of the data they've had historically on these legacy systems and legacy infrastructure, right, is 80% unstructured. So they can't use it, right, with AI. So now they're deciding they need to take a step back, actually get a solid data governance infrastructure on there before then they can go move forward with AI.
The old catchphrase from Secretary Rumsfeld, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, applies, it sounds like, in this data space to what the department is trying to wrap its arms around. Is that a fair read on that?
Absolutely. In fact, we kind of say you can't govern what you can't see.
Yeah.
And that puts an immense amount of risk, right? Particularly in this world of cyber and cybersecurity, right? So if there's missing data, right, or somebody in some data silo gets their hands on it, an adversary, right, and they didn't even know it existed, right, it's creating great risk. So that's why they need to get their own house in order, right, to be able to securely deliver their mission.
Are the risk management best practices in this area the same as risk management best practices in other parts of the technology landscape?
Not exactly. I mean, obviously, we have a heavy presence, at Iron Mountain in the civilian space, and there's a completely different, we do the tax returns, right, and some of the veterans claims processing. In this space, though, you've got a much more, obviously, even you can see at the show, a physical nature to it, meaning there are physical assets, right, that are depending upon this data. A little bit different than a tax return form or a veteran's claim. So a little bit more dangerous, I would say.
And it's interesting to me, too, because with all the sensors that everybody are talking about here, those are all feeding data. So those physical assets are also generating data that I imagine must be part of that data governance challenge.
It is. So as I said, every day, there's kind of what the statistic is, like 453 terabytes, right, of data. And, to try and track it. If you don't even have a data structure in place for your legacy data, there's no way. They keep piling in, and that's why 80% is still unstructured data, because they're not taking care of it and putting a strategy together to actually structure it as it's coming in.
How important is it to go back and structure data that's not structured versus what you just described, which is making sure that it's structured as you get it?
We believe, particularly, here in the Department of Defense and the other commands, is with some of the other activities they've had in some of the regions, right? If they don't have that structured, right, and they can't use that as lessons learned, everything from topical kind of information or even previous kind of video feeds that they've gotten, they're really missing out, right? And maybe starting from scratch when they wouldn't have needed.
You can read more about data in the military and all across the government on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, as the Arctic gets warmer, the competition ramps up. Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose continues in a moment.
Zero Trust is transforming cybersecurity across government. You'll learn what it takes to put it into action on Zero Trust in depth.
It's a mind shift. It's a paradigm. It's not only about just buying a tool. And that's a big part of that. For our civilian federal agencies and some of our DoD agencies, that is new to them, right? They're used to being able to share data ubiquitously with them in the organization. That's that culture shift that they need to understand and say, what are the changes that I need to make to policy? So a big part of that is what is the innovative side, I guess you could say, from Zero Trust, right? That's where AI and ML come in, where your secure access service edge for secure control of anyone, wherever they are in the world. We have remote work. We're still coming back to the office, but we still have to control our data, our users, our systems in a similar way in each case.
Welcome back. The Coast Guard has an icebreaker now that's new to its fleet, but it's not a brand new ship. The service bought what's now the Coast Guard cutter Storus on the commercial market while it waits for the construction of a brand new polar security cutter. Abbie Tingstad is Arctic research professor at the Coast Guard Academy at Sea Air Space. She tells me how the Guard is connecting acquisition programs and the hardware that comes out of them to strategy.
With the polar security cutters, those are a heavier icebreaker. And there's a difference between being able to physically access a region and having a presence, which to me is much more enduring, much more, geographically distributed, kind of being able to be where you need to be and do what you need to do when you need to, right? And right now, the U.S. has plenty of capabilities of accessing the Arctic and Antarctic, but not necessarily the ability to be exactly where you need someone to be, if that makes sense. Yeah. So having greater capacity is going to be really, really important. And I mentioned the Antarctic as well, because actually the Polar Security Cutter program, at least as originally intended, is a little more focused on the Antarctic mission. Not that it wouldn't be useful in the Arctic as well, but I just wanted to highlight that the U.S. has some really important presence needs at both poles. And so when you even think about that, it's almost a multiplied capacity need as well.
So what does presence, how does one define presence in the Arctic, especially considering Russia's more active there than they ever have been? China has declared itself a near Arctic nation. How is that dynamic changing the way that the United States strategically thinks about what it should be doing there?
Right. Well, it starts actually with just having awareness of what's going on in the region and being able to communicate about it. And I think that really highlights the fact that even though icebreakers are one of the most, visible types of polar presence, they're not the only type of polar presence that, the U.S. and other nations need there. So it really starts with being able to know what's going on, communicating it, and then being able to get to where you need to be, whether that's by icebreaker or it might be by fixed-wing aircraft, it might be by helicopter, it might be by all of the above and something else as well. People are also really important, especially trained personnel to do search and rescue in the Arctic and other things are an important part of the portfolio also. So to me, presence really means having everything that is required to execute a mission. And those missions look different depending on where you are, whether in the Arctic or Antarctic.
So what is the full inventory that we as a nation, not even necessarily just Coast Guard assets, but what should be there in order to have the presence that we as a nation should have vis-a-vis China and Russia, especially now?
Yeah. So, it's really combining all of the capabilities that we have to access the different domains. And I use that term loosely. I know that it has a definition, but we can think about, surface and subsurface, of course, air, land, but also the electromagnetic spectrum, cyber domain, things like this. And so it's really about having the ability to know what's going on in and across all of those domains, and then being able to go and execute whatever effect you need to do in order to shape the activities in those domains in a way that benefits the U.S. national and homeland security.
Another thing that I understand is changing dramatically there is the environment. I spoke to a retired Navy admiral. It's been about 2 years since he and I had this conversation, but he had about 2 years before that been in the Arctic for the first time in about 25 years. And I said, what were the major differences? He said, number one, it was dramatically more accessible than it had ever been before. And number two, he said there was a lot more plastic in the water than he had seen the first time, which he considered important. How is the differing condition, the changing conditions in that part of the world changing the way that we should approach it strategically?
Yeah. So I think understanding that it is changing and that it is changing in different ways at a relatively rapid pace is really important. And one good example of that is that you mentioned increased accessibility. I think it's important to note that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not hazardous to navigate in the Arctic region. And that's one thing that I think sometimes when we read the news, I think we sometimes mistake having less sea ice part of the year for being like, oh, we'll just send up a cruise vessel and it'll be fine, you know, without any additional safeguards and things like that. So one thing that's becoming increasingly important is really understanding how changes in sea ice, changes for those that are concerned with land, you know, physical environments, ice roads and things like that. And also, as you noted, you know, changes in the way that humans are using the Arctic region, whether that be economically or otherwise. You mentioned Russia and China earlier, understanding patterns of you know, Russian behavior in the Arctic, understanding patterns of Chinese behavior in the Arctic, very important, and understanding how those are different as well, and how U.S. Kind of historical partners in the Arctic region are also you know, maybe sharing some of the U.S.'s goals and interests in the Arctic region, but in some ways are also different.
Who are our most important partners strategically there? I would obviously think of Canada first of all. Who else are our most important valuable partners in Arctic strategy?
Yeah, so I would say that fundamentally it's really the Arctic countries themselves. So, and you mentioned Canada, of course. There are so many reasons to think of Canada first and foremost, and I think those continue in terms of where the Arctic is going. The Nordic countries, of course, are important partners as well. And you know, over the summer, the U.S. and Norway, for example, you know, had a space launch together, led by Norwegian Space Agency, of course, but the U.S. was able to put some payloads on that. So that kind of demonstrates another important way that the U.S. has partnered with the Nordic countries historically. And, you know, historically, too, and this is a difficult topic in some ways, but thinking about Russia, you know, how has the U.S. engaged with Russia in the past in the Arctic, and how has that changed? Because in some ways, when it comes to things like co-managing, you know, incidents that may happen in the Bering Strait, in that sense, Russia is that country that the U.S. is communicating with. So it is a bit of a complicated landscape, or seascape, if you will. But I think first and foremost, we have to think of the Arctic in that holistic way, that there are different ways of partnering with different actors in that region.
Considering, coming from the posture of China and Russia being potential adversaries, are their interests in the Arctic the same or similar, or is there an opportunity for us to gain some kind of leverage with one versus the other if their interests are separate or if they diverge? Yeah,
I think their interests are very different, actually. And I don't want to discount the potential threat and danger of having Russia and China partnering and sometimes in very, very closely with you know, surface vessels going together in the Arctic region. I don't want to discount that at all. But I do want to note that Russia is an Arctic nation with a lot of history in the Arctic, a lot of its own economic interests in the Arctic, whereas China is not an Arctic state. They did declare themselves a near Arctic state some while ago, but I believe that they've actually stopped using that particular term at this point. And then if you actually look at China's level of economic investment in the Arctic region, there is a lot of money in it, perhaps financially, but a lot of that is really within Siberian natural gas projects. And so China has not always been successful in some of its other projects that it's been looking to do. So overall, its economic footprint, if you will, in the Arctic remains very small if you look at it from that perspective. Yes, China does have icebreakers. In terms of other Arctic capabilities, not particularly. And so we might also think about China's strategic interests in the Arctic. Yes, like some other non-Arctic states, interested in kind of looking into the region as having a foothold. I think China especially wants to be seen as a nation with Arctic interests and capabilities. But some of the other types of activities that China maybe has done in the Arctic may very well have to do a little bit more about Beijing's displeasure with U.S. policy in other parts of the world, as opposed to what's actually going on in the Arctic. And I think policy that understands that China and Russia are different actors in the Arctic could very well be stronger, because after all, Russia and China do not have a very positive history together if you look over the course of time. And so perhaps it's convenient for them to be engaging together right now in the Arctic region, but whether that will last into the future, I actually think the U.S. and its Arctic allies could actually have a big role in how that looks in the years to come.
What's the future look like in your view? What are the markers? I know it's impossible to predict the future, but what do the markers look like moving forward in that part of the world in your view?
Yeah. Well, I think this is really a nice opportunity. I guess I'm a glass half full person, but I think it's a nice opportunity really to build on some of the work that the Arctic nations and others and other stakeholders, including the indigenous groups in the Arctic, have really done right, which is kind of coming together, trying to foresee problems that may happen. And even though there is not necessarily a completely common vision probably for the region, but at least drawing on things that they do have in common and trying to make those happen. Now, I also think that there are many stumbling blocks potentially. There is a lot of different types of changes across all the different, physical environment, economics, security, military. But I also think it's very much within Arctic stakeholders and, hands, to do something about it. So I take a positive view of it.
You can read more about the Arctic on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. FedGov Today continues in a moment.
Create AI with integrity, not bias. Security that helps protect your data anywhere. Automated systems that make work less work. Cloud management that requires less management. And new ways for government to do business. Join IBM at their Washington, D.C. Innovation Studio, Cyber Range, and O-Labs. Explore how AI, hybrid cloud, and quantum computing can help transform your mission. Take ideas from inspiration to action. Get started at ibm.com/industries/federal.
Welcome back. In today's event spotlight, your agency's customer experience modernization effort shouldn't be all digital. You'll learn why and how to modernize one of the oldest customer interactions at the Contact Center Summit, coming April 30th at the Carasoft Conference and Collaboration Center in Reston, Virginia. Government and industry leaders will show you how AI and data can make your job and your customers' experiences better. You can read more about the event and register at fedgovtoday.com/events. FedGov Today TV returns next Sunday morning at 10:30. The commander of Navy Fleet Forces Command, Admiral Daryl Caudle, is here. I'm Francis Rose. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Have a great week.